this progressive piece of legislation, as we seek to bring everything into one place, centralize everything so that we can respond more quickly and more efficiently and effectively to the needs of others. Of course, I am very happy to see that this piece of legislation interacts with the Child Protection Act, which we passed not long ago, in terms of the provision of child care centers. And as we would have mentioned then, child care centers are specialized places, and we will have to have trained persons working there. But I wish to suggest that in terms of elder care and persons with disabilities, there are some agencies out there that are doing some very good work in terms of care for the elderly and disabled. And I would like to think that, I know it's already happening, but this piece of legislation and the amalgamation of these agencies provides the opportunity for greater partnership between this agency and the private entities out there. And just to add a story of my own, just 2 Saturdays ago, I had the opportunity to go to bless an elder care home. And I was very proud to see what was happening. But what touched me most were the comments, the testimonies of the families of the persons who had their elderly there. There were some people whose loved one had died, but they still came back to the home because they had built a family setting. And one of those persons said, you know something? In the future, these homes will not be simply for those who have ailments and disabilities and are not able to move around anymore. He said, she didn't put it this way, but I'll add this. These homes will become the haven for those who are experiencing the new pandemic, loneliness. And she said, all of us should start looking, especially single women, women who've lost their spouses and so on. Start looking for somewhere to book yourself into, because it will not be about disabilities and lack of mobility and all those things. This is about finding a place where you can interact with other people to deal with that pandemic of loneliness. We have seen only recently the report from CARFA, which suggests that persons seeking mental care in our facilities throughout the region has increased by 100% post-COVID, which means that there is a need for a greater response to persons who, as Senator Worrell would have pointed out, you may go to a home and see a television, a nice house and everything, but that doesn't mean that there's not a problem there. It doesn't mean that that person does not need help, does not need the help of this agency. So I believe that this is where partnerships can come in with non-governmental organizations, particularly churches, who have centers and so on, not seeking anything tangible from the government, but just seeking to do our part to make sure that our community has the type of stability that is necessary for it to develop and to grow. And so I look forward to greater partnerships coming out of this particular piece of legislation. But it would be remiss of me if I spoke and didn't make the point that though I began with the words of Mahatma Gandhi, that the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members, it would be a grave omission of me as a minister of religion not to say that that was said centuries before that by our Lord himself in Matthew 25, when he gave what will be the criteria by which we'll be judged. And I often tell people, it will not be by how many times you got marked present at church, or how lustily you sang. It is when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. And when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you took care of me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was estranged, you made me feel welcome. But the important part of that particular teaching is what Jesus underscored it with. Inasmuch as you do it to the least of one of these, the most vulnerable in the society, that is what will count. And I would like to encourage us, as we still call ourselves a Christian community, to place this piece of legislation within the context of that particular call by our Lord himself, to remember that everything we do, the ultimate judgment will be how we treat it to the least of those amongst us. And so once again, I wish to commend the government for this piece of legislation in centralizing these agencies, but also I wish to join with my fellow senators who have done so before in thanking the many angels out there who work in these different agencies. Because I've often said, when you work caring for the elderly, the job of nurses, caring for the sick, those are not jobs. So vocations. You have to love it to do it. And those people get up every day and go out there and care for those who are vulnerable as though they were a part of them. And so I want to commend them today and encourage them to continue to do the work they do for the betterment of our community. And with those few words, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. Senator Andre Boyce.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Thank you for recognizing me. Sir, as I was sitting here and listening to all of the contributions so far this morning around the critical importance of the Social Empowerment Agency, it dawned on me that this too was about the question of resilience. How does a country respond to the challenges, there's a saying that goes that the poor will always be with us and that the vulnerable will always be with us. And it is the work of a caring government to ensure that there is an apt and adequate response. And I think that that is what this is. Sir, we know the perennial complaints about the provisioning of social services in this country. We heard some of them this morning about the extent to which that provisioning has been disjointed, that it has not been fast enough, and that it has not met the people where they are. Suffice it to say, sir, that many of the provisions in this legislation are aimed at tackling those things. But perhaps more importantly, sir, there is a connection between so much of the work that this government has done around legislative reform and crafting rights and protections that never existed before and this piece of legislation. You will notice when you go through the legislation, sir, that there is a connection between the remit of this organization and the substantive work of disability and the substantive work of the Child Protection Act and the substantive work of what will ultimately be the rights of older persons legislation in this country. And that seamlessness, that connection between the operating agency and the substantive rights are really what are going to improve the realities for persons, for vulnerable persons. I think very often, sir, we think, certainly in the provisioning of social services and when we think about the elderly and the disabled and children, we think of them as disparate constituencies, disparate communities, and we don't necessarily think that the identities may commingle. I will tell you, sir, that that is not the case, and that there are individuals who may come to need the services of the Child Care Board, what was formerly the Child Care Board, and the National Disabilities Unit, that will come to need the assistance of a National Assistance Board, Mr. President, and the Welfare Department. And what that means is that we have to have a holistic approach to the provisioning of social care, but the enjoyment of rights more fundamentally. And I think that that is what this legislation seeks to do. I do not intend to be long, but there are a couple of things I wanted to respond to in relation to the submission made by the Honorable Senator Worrell. Just to say, sir, I know there was some concern raised about the terms for the existing civil servants, and I wish to say that there has been an evaluation exercise and that the unions have been deeply engaged in this multi-year process, and that there is a commitment, sir, to ensuring that all the employees no doubt enjoy benefits no less favorable than that which they enjoyed previously. Mr. President, I also want to respond. There was a passing comment made by the Honorable Senator about his delight that this legislation has come because we could not operationalize the disability legislation. And it is technically true. And we can engage in, I think, the tabulated legalism of saying that this must have come first and then this. And we can engage in the analysis so as to confuse, Mr. President. But I think all that needs to be said is that this legislation, if it meets the favor of those of us present here this evening, will come to be prior to any substantive legislation, any substantive programmatic legislation like the aforementioned disability legislation and child protection legislation. So I just wanted to make that clear for members of the public in case there was any confusion in that regard. And I will end, Mr. President, I said I was going to be brief, with the call for joining the call for partnership and joining the call for making Barbados better by the dint of all of our contributions. The Honorable Senator Cummins referred to the fact that in all of our various capacities, we contribute to making this country better. And if we don't, we can and we must, Mr. President. And I want to echo those comments. And certainly in the work that I have been involved with in relation to the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, there is a commitment, sir, that we cannot do it alone, and we do not propose to do it alone. And I think that that is the commitment of this government. And so I no doubt ask all Barbadians to join us in the heavy lifting of making this country better, safer, and more inclusive for every Barbadian. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Please. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you all to the honourable senators who have spoken. I want to acknowledge the comments made by each one of you, and I note the broad support given on this resolution, and I agree with Senator Nurse's contribution about the important work of social workers and the importance of them being recognized. I believe Senator Rogers, in his contribution, pointed out that this is not just a job, this is a vocation. And I think that it is important for us to be able to continue to work to recognize the work of those persons who, day to day, week to week, in good times and bad times, they are there and they stand up and they're willing to serve. I just want to respond to a couple of points that were raised earlier by the Honourable Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate. I believe that Senator, the Honourable Deputy President of the Chamber, has already responded to the pit toilet program, and I don't think that there's anything that I can add there, but I believe that in 2018, it was in our 2018 manifesto, it was in our 2022 manifesto, and it has been clear under the RDC and the UDC that the government has a pit toilet eradication program. I believe that when we have heard updates coming specifically from those agencies over the last several years, the issues with persons having pit toilets were linked very closely to the fact that there were challenges with the ownership of land. Who owned the land? How do you reconcile making changes to property that is not owned by the occupant at the time? And how do we interact with land owners or homeowners in those instances? But those have been the circumstances under which we have encountered difficulties. But where those difficulties have not existed, this government has gone in and has implemented its promises as it relates to the pit toilet eradication program. I want also to just make a quick point here about the reference to a government who has spent on social services, and I believe that the honourable member from the opposition side raised issues about how the government is executing on its social service program. I believe we've heard over the last several years how much money is allocated in this administration on an annual basis to the social services and to the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. That's not even up for question. I think that the honourable member may want to then, in fact, perhaps over the course of the next couple of weeks, reflect instead on what was done in previous administrations, because we're clear on what was done in ours. Now, the question of rights and conditions of service, pension benefits, staff transitioning over to the Social Empowerment Agency, there was an industrial rights consultant on the project. There were extensive consultations with the labor unions, all of the labor unions and all of the staff members. And so the lack of equivalence, or whether there was equivalence from post to post, is well determined as a consequence of those processes. We did not come here, and I was very careful in my initial comments to point out that we did not get here because it was cooked up in the mind of a minister or in the mind of any individual. This was a lengthy process, and in fact, started when the last Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs under the Honourable Cynthia Ford, and it continued and picked up pace post-COVID with the Honourable Kirk Humphrey. It is not rushed, not even close, and in so doing, it was done comprehensive and in a very deliberate way. During COVID, when it was paused, Mr. President, that was the reason why we then found ourselves having to come back afterwards and engage with the labor unions, because consultations needed to continue post to post, terms and conditions of service, offer letters, all of those things then needed to have been undertaken, and that work was done. So if there are differences in the scales, in the salary scales, that has been determined not just by the labor unions, but by the public sector, where the public service then had to look at every post that was being transitioned over to these agencies and to ensure that they correlated to the scales of salaries and personal emoluments that are captured in the public sector. This is not something that was done in any fly-by-night way, and I want to give that assurance. I want to reiterate for the record as well, none of the amalgamations that this government has undertaken have had the impact of causing job losses. That is not our way, Mr. President. Now, there was a query raised about the role of an executive director relative to a director on the board of directors, but this is corporate governance. This is almost basic corporate governance. You have an executive director who is a functional and a corporate lead, and the boards of directors, they're not interchangeable posts at all, but the boards of directors, they are also still called directors, but they have more of a corporate governance role. But they're two very separate and distinct areas of responsibility. Senator Rogers, in his contribution, also a very strong contribution. I appreciate the comments that were being made, and I look forward to the opportunity for the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs to begin the process of the amalgamation. I think one of the reasons why we're here today on a Friday is because we are at the end of the financial year, and the government's books will close off formally today. and they will begin the process of transitioning on Monday. And so we needed to make sure that we had vested the resources that are allocated for these agencies in the coming days to allow for the transition, the seamless transition, effective April 1 to the new financial year. And so I give the assurance that this work has been well thought out, well developed, well consulted on, and it will also equally be well executed and well implemented. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. I think it's the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. We think it's the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, may we take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 to 3.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 through 3 stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 through 3 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 4 to 21.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2 do now stand part. Part 2, clauses 4 through clauses 21.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 4 through 21 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 22 and 23.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 22 and 23 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 22 and 23 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 24 to 32.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 24 to 32 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 24 to 32 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 33 to 45.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 33 to 45 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 33 through 45 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be now the schedule to the bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be now the second schedule to the bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The third schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be now the third schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the fourth schedule be the fourth schedule to the bill.
The question is that the fourth schedule be now the fourth schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Gomez.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Social Empowerment Agency Act 2025.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Social Empowerment Agency Act 2025. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 10, sir. Naming the Honourable Leader of the Senate, in which it has been assigned to Senator Dr. the Honourable Monroe Knight to move the second reading of the Rural and Urban Development Commission Bill 2025.
Senator the Honourable Dr. Chantal Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like the other speakers before me, I also want to welcome Senator Jonathan Reid, who I count as a friend. I would have been working with Jonathan from day one when I came into government, as was indicated, working in the Prime Minister's office. So I know that Jonathan will bring some changes because that's who he is. And Jonathan would also as well bring his heart and focus to his work. Most persons have spoken to the contribution of Senator Crystal Haynes in the chamber, but I want to speak perhaps to a different side of Senator Haynes, because when I came into the chamber, I was sitting right next to Senator Haynes. And if there's ever one to give you a word of encouragement and to make you feel welcome continuously over the journey, it has been Dr. Crystal Haynes for me. So I'm going to miss her tremendously in that role, miss her warmth, and again, and her contribution. But certainly, I considered Dr. Senator Haynes, my senator buddy. So I'm gonna miss her. Mr. President, I'm not going to be long in this bill, because a lot of the considerations that we have discussed in the previous bill also apply. The considerations around how we ensure that we take care of the most vulnerable, as we heard about, the considerations around how do we make sure that in transitioning that we right-size organizations are also applicable as we consider this Rural and Urban Development Commission bill. We have spoken, Mr. President, in this chamber already about government's transformation agenda. And we've talked about the fact that the transformation agenda is one that is built on a number of pillars. If you look at the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan, BERT, you would see again the outline of those pillars that have been identified, in which the government has said that it will drive change, drive growth, drive development for Barbados. In particular, mission transformation applies specifically to the public service, It is that agenda that the government has set itself in order to ensure that it seeks to have a public service that will deliver for people. And that is something, again, that we spoke about in the previous debate, that it will deliver for people. Because we recognize, Mr. President, that as much as this government has had a tremendous record in terms of how we have been able to right-size the economy, to do the necessary fiscal reforms, and I would dare say, Mr. President, that that record and evidence of that stands, and it would only be those who would have reason to shut their eyes and be blind to the truth that would not acknowledge that this is a government who we have heard, Mr. President, by the end of this month, March 31st, will have a record of 15 consecutive quarters, 45 months, nearly 4 years of growth. That we have a record in which our debt to GDP will dip to 100%, under, Mr. President, 100%, for the first time since 2012. And I will not go any further, because the point I'm making here is that while we recognize that there are some fiscal metrics that we have done well, Mr. President, we also recognize that there are some other fundamental things that we have to correct about how citizens are able to access services, interface with government, and how we are to ensure, again, that we treat to all Barbadians in a way that they can feel part of the society, and in a way that we can ensure forward progress for all Barbadians. And for us, that is the fundamental task. Because we understand that as much as we can take care, like I said, of those fiscal metrics, of the macroeconomic picture, and which we have been doing, it is those things about the interaction between government and citizens in terms of being able to access services. Those are the things that matter to people. Those are the things that cause frustrations and complaints for Barbadians. And those are the things that we need to take care of. This year, we have said to ourselves as a government that we have to look at making sure that we excel in the basics of delivery. Excel in the basics of delivery. What does that mean? It means that we have to hold ourselves as a government accountable for the functioning of all of our departments and agencies. It means that we have to deconstruct and make sure that we identify where the blockages are. Some of them are small, some of them may be big, but that we identify them and set about to change and to restructure. And Mr. President, change is often difficult. There are going to be some things that you can tinker with, but then there are going to be some things that you have to be able to restructure fully in order for them to be right-sized. And that is that program of transformation. That is that program of delivering for citizens. That is that program of making sure that we are able to right-size government agencies and institutions. And I'm going to not get tired, Mr. President, of repeating it, delivering for people. Because very often, this government is to be lectured on the extent to which it is working on the behalf of people. And this transformation agenda this agenda mission transformation, it is exactly built on that awareness that we need to make sure that we are taking care of and delivering for people, Mr. President. This is a large agenda. The agenda for transformation, for right-sizing, for making sure that we have institutions that are going to be sensitive to and responsive to people and their needs. Mr. President, I hope that we can all agree it's a large agenda. Some of the challenges within the public service are endemic to the public service. They've been there for a long time across administrations. They're not going to be easily changed. It's going to be difficult. This is an agenda that governments worldwide, globally, are attempting to tackle, and there's a shared recognition that it is difficult and that it is big. But this government has always been one. Name it, face it, and deal with it, Mr. President. That is who this administration is, and that is what we are attempting continually to be able to do. Mr. President, we did an analysis of the government's, what I'm going to call as the call center. I think everybody knows it as perhaps as the call center. After the first 6 months of the functioning, we decided to take a look and see what some of those responses were telling us about how well government was doing in relation to citizens' perception of what was happening. And what that analysis showed us is that, one, we know that our government agencies are taking too long to respond to complaints. We know, Mr. President, that there are a continual frustration around 3 or 4 critical things that people continually call about and call for redress and call for resolution about, that we have not necessarily been responsive to, Mr. President. That analysis showed us as well that that is across those complaints, that feeling that government is not being responsive, is across age groups, but more so as well for those within that cohort from about 50, Mr. President, to like about 70 or so. That large age group, we know that those were the most persons that not only called, but identified some of those perennial problems that they saw with the delivery of government services. And Mr. President, that recognition and that acknowledgement is not an attack on the public service or any particular department, but is a recognition of a government that is being reflective. It is one of the reasons that we also ask all government departments to establish customer service charters, so that throughout the public service now, government departments are asked to have service charters that hold them accountable to citizens and people that they have to engage with in terms of the delivery of their services. Within the service charter, they have to establish targets, they have to monitor, and they have to be accountable for that. We've only started on the exercise, Mr. President, just recently. We will continue to train, continue to monitor, so that I think this is going into the new financial year. We will be asking people to report on how well they have been doing in relation to meeting those targets that they have established within their service charters. And all of this is an effort to make sure that we keep ourselves accountable for that agenda for mission transformation and how we deal with changing and fixing some things within the public service. Part of that agenda, Mr. President, you will see in government's focus on digitization and digitalization as well. But that is only part of the agenda, Mr. President. Because change and transformation is multifaceted. So you would look at this bill that we are looking at, the Rural and Urban Development Commission bill. And that is only one part of it. So the legislation is one part of it. But then we don't see as well, again, the digital infrastructure that will be part of that. The business processing that will change as well. The training that has to happen to make sure that the employees now are sensitive and responsive as well. All of that is part of that process of transformation. So that we have that, this bill, but that there are other things that will undergird it to ensure as well that we can have now a Rural and Development Commission that is right-sized in a number of different ways. And you will see that pattern, Mr. President, being repeated. Similarly, like the bill that we would have just, the act now that we would have just debated and discussed. And that we understand that even in the construction of the process, change management specialists were brought on and engaged from the beginning, discussions were taking place, and that there is a pathway for further training, etc., Mr. President. So that that process is underlined, yes, underpinned by the legislation, but also as well recognizing that transformation is complex, that there are other things that have to be done in order to make it a reality and to have that change as much as possible fully instilled. But again, the government has been doing a number of things to try to relieve, Mr. President, some of the frustration that I would have spoken to already in terms of citizens. We would have heard that government intends to move as much as possible to a cashless system. We would know that government is piloting on the transport board as well, cashless payments. It is currently piloting in the first stage for senior citizens that they'd be able to use their ID cards and tap, or if they don't have one of the new ones, at least be able to present it to the bus driver. Again, trying to make life easier. Mr. President, on our EasyPay platform, I don't know how many Barbadians realize we have over 52 services on that platform that you can go up and that you don't have to stand in a long line anymore to get service, that you can use your debit card, credit card, even your PSC card. I understand if you want to pay cash, you can just click an option there for the post office, get a receipt, and go to the post office and pay 52 services. There are about 6 services or so that you would normally have to go in the long line to pay at BRA that you can now do through EasyPay. Your corporation tax, Mr. President, you can go and pay your PAYE, you can pay your withholding tax, you can pay driver's license, all of that you can pay through EasyPay. And all of that is part of government's agenda for transformation, Mr. President. All of that is part of excelling in the basics and making it easier for Barbadians. And so that this bill that we are considering, Mr. President, this afternoon, has to be considered within that context of transformation. We're not just changing an agency just because, but we're changing an agency because it forms part of a larger process of changing, reforming, restructuring, and most importantly, of delivering, Mr. President, and delivering for people. So that the bill will repeal the Rural Development Commission Act, CAP 238, and the Urban Development Act, CAP 241, and now establish the Rural and Urban Development Commission. We have had the Urban Development Commission, Mr. President, since 1997, and Rural since 1996. Almost what, 3 decades? That we've had these institutions around. Almost 3 decades, right? That we've had these institutions working for us. And we would have heard in the other place that the genesis for these institutions was around addressing the need for a government who saw people, Mr. President, poor people, felt them, heard them, and said we were unsatisfied with the pace of delivery of services, and that we needed agencies that will be tasked specifically Mr. President, to make sure that we can enhance and propel development, delivery of services in communities to poor and vulnerable people who needed them the most. And that was the impetus behind these two agencies. Again, Mr. President, a government who understands the most vulnerable and what needs to be done in order to ensure that we can take care of them and that we can deliver for them. But 3 decades and things have changed. If we look at the legislation, for instance, for the Rural Development Commission, and you look at what that commission had been assigned to do, you would note, for instance, that it was asked to provide assistance to small farmers in the areas of agricultural training and investment, equipment and machinery, production and marketing of agricultural products, and so on and so on. And now, the majority of those tasks are now with the Ministry of Agriculture. So they no longer now need to be provided under rural. And you would see again, when you look at the current legislation and look at the functions of the commission that we are considering, you will not then see those tasks, those functions also embodied there. Because like I said, they are now assigned to another ministry. 3 decades on, things have moved and changed, Mr. President. But what you will continually see, though, again, is the continuation of the fundamental understanding that the Rural and Development Commission is about addressing the core needs of the vulnerable within our communities. Mr. President, if I were to stand here and to say to anyone, even those on my side, that one, mission transformation and what the government is trying to do with its agenda at reform is working perfectly, I'm sure that they will all be looking at me and say I belong in the psyche, right? Because we would admit as well that some things are not moving as quickly as we want them to move, Mr. President. Mr. President, we would agree that some things that you have a vision for because of the nature of the challenges don't always work as smoothly, Mr. President. So that, yes, there are challenges within the system, but again, a government that is committed to facing it and fixing it will continually, Mr. President, make sure that we identify, again, those blockages and attempt to be able to move forward. So that there are those that would criticize the functioning of the two institutions, rural and urban. And again, Mr. President, they can be free to be able to do so. But I hope as well that they would admit, Mr. President, in an honest way, that these two institutions have also as well served this country and served many poor people very, very, very well. One of the things that, again, this government is always asked is how are we ensuring that entrepreneurs and other small business people are benefiting from government processes and what government is doing. And within the Urban and Rural Development Commission that we have, that is exactly what is happening. Mr. President, we may not realize it, but within the design of the two agencies right now, what they do is to utilize small contractors, Mr. President, in order to be able to deliver the work. So it is small contractors from different communities that have the opportunity through the existing agencies to be able to provide work. Mr. President, approximately annually, 105 small contractors are being utilized in those agencies to be able to provide assistance across a number of different areas, whether they're working as building contractors, providing services in other areas, Mr. President. Mr. President, whether it was in the Baxter's Road redevelopment, whether it was in the Fairchild Street Terminal redevelopment, small contractors have been employed to be able to deliver the works so that what we have is not only an agency that is about delivering directly, but also as well in its design is empowering at the same time, Mr. President. Mr. President, the ethos and the need for the work of the agencies, even as we seek within this particular bill to combine them, still stands, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I walk through certain areas in Barbados, I have noted that there are a number of elderly persons who are living alone in dilapidated households. I came across one gentleman, and I keep talking about him because the condition was so stark. Living alone, no family, no utilities whatsoever, Mr. President, none. I'm not exaggerating here for public notice, no utilities. Depend on neighbors to make sure that he gets a meal. And the house, instead of the house, there's one plank that runs through the middle of the house, that if you are not careful to walk on that plank, your foot will see the dirt at the bottom. He lives in that every day. Another elderly lady that I found, house covered, taller, and I'm fairly short. Jonathan is taller than me, with grass as tall as Senator Reid around her house. And that is what she lives in, has to come out in every single day. Every single day. Bats, rats, that's how she lives. So I say that, and I use those examples to say, Mr. President, and I think the leader of government business spoke about it. We have this view sometimes of Barbadians and how we live that sometimes do not reflect the reality of the most vulnerable. And the need to ensure that we have institutions that would be able to address those situations. And I'm very happy to say that after sitting down and speaking to one on one hand, because you know with urban and rural we got this divide. So the area that I'm speaking about, one house is in one area that belongs to urban, and then I gotta go up a little, and we gotta walk 10 minutes, and then the other house belongs then to rural, yeah? And I have this divide. So after having to go, Mr. President, and speak to urban on one end, and then speak to rural, I am satisfied that we will be able to deal with both of those cases, Mr. President, that I spoke about. So that is also one of the important things as well about this bill. In that where I had to go to urban and talk to them and make a case and you know, let them know what was the situation, then I had to go over here and talk to rural and give the same information. Now, the intent is that we have one agency who is then able to bring together all of the necessary resources. Because you had two agencies, sometimes overlapping mandates, overlapping work, but under-resourced, whether or not that under-resource was in terms of people or financial resources. So that the intent now is that we bring all of the resources of those two agencies together, again, so that they have scale and are able to deliver better for people, Mr. President. I want to say as well, Mr. President, and this is an important point here, when we talk about delivery and investment in the institutions that are there, and government's continual commitment to making sure that these two agencies that will now become the Rural and Urban Development Commission will be able to work in a way that, like I said, provides scale, make sure that they can reduce some of the duplication that would have had before, make sure, Mr. President, that they can serve a wider spectrum of persons and that they were perhaps able to do before. But it's also about making sure that they have the necessary resources in order to be able to do so. It is interesting, Mr. President, that again, this government is continually being accused, and the suggestion is that we are not paying due attention, again, to the most vulnerable within our societies, that our policies don't speak to people and what they are managing every day. It was interesting, Mr. President, to learn that the previous administration, over the period of 2015 to 2017, over those years, continually reduced the amount of funds available, in particular to the Rural Development Commission, so that before that period, the Rural Development Commission would have been receiving something like $12 million. By 2015, the Democratic Labour Party administration that was in power reduced that vote to $8 million, Mr. President. 2017, $8 million. 2018, $8.5 million, Mr. President. When this administration came into power, in 2020, we moved, did I say 8 million? I was going to say 5.6, because it was 5. Did I say 5.6, 5 million, right? We went from that 5 million, 5.5 million to 8 million. What was happening in 2020, Mr. President? What was happening in this country in 2020? We were going through COVID. So a government that was under pressure came in with an economy that was tight at a time when our main money earner tourism was at an all-time low, decided, as it did in the case of university education, that we were going to put that money in an institution that was dedicated to dealing with poor people. Mr. President, the same thing in 2021, Mr. President. So we moved from that 8 million, Mr. President, to 10.5 million, Mr. President, increasing every year till 2023, Mr. President, $18.6 million in investment to deliver for poor people in Barbados. That is the level of commitment that this government has. So that while some prefer to jump up and beat the chest and holler out and point, this government sometimes is guilty of being too humble. It is sometimes too humble.
Say it again.
And we are too humble. We are too humble. And you know why? Because taking care of poor people is not extraordinary for us, Mr. President. It is part of who we are. So it is ordinary when we deliver. It is ordinary when we deliver, Mr. President. So we don't have to holler and jump up and keep noise. And we get on with the job. We deliver, Mr. President. And we also do it practically, because we don't just talk about it. We don't just talk about it. The record is clear of the government's investment and continued investment in making sure that we have agencies that deliver for people. That deliver for people, Mr. President. And it's interesting as well, because if we take those cuts, we had some hard choices to make. The economy wasn't doing good. But let's see, Senator Blackman, what is it they were cutting? That was money to eradicate pit toilets in Barbados, though. It was money that was supposed to help with building ramps for the disabled, Mr. President. It was money for house repairs, Mr. President, for those that could not afford it, Mr. President. It was money for small business owners, Mr. President, support for small business owners, Mr. President. That is what was cut. And that is what this government is reinvesting in. And that is what this government is still on an agenda to transform, to make sure that it can deliver even better and more for people, Mr. President. That is our commitment, and that is something, Mr. President, that this government will ensure that it does. The Urban Development Commission, this year, for example, completed 164 houses, renovated 289, installed wells, septic tanks, and a number of other services, including in some cases where some houses didn't have electrical services, Mr. President, to help with that, Mr. President, as well. Mr. President, one of the things that the rural does, for instance, is help with lighting in areas where there's not enough lighting. Mr. President, in that area that I traverse consistently, Mr. President, where some people don't see other people, but I traverse consistently, Mr. President, there is an area in which there is a woman who, every time she sees me, she reminds me, because she said, I can't go home, because she was attacked in her area because of the poor lighting. She said, I can't go home. So she works in Oistins. And on Friday and Saturday night, she sleeps down in Oistins. True story, I am not embellishing. Nothing I have said, Mr. President, is an embellishment. Because she said the lighting down there is better and she feels safer than having to go home at that time of the morning, it would be, and risk possible attack. This is the service that these agencies are committed to delivering for poor people, Mr. President. Because some of us that would have it, we could go and ask for lighting power and pay the money and get a pole put up. This serves poor people, Mr. President. And as both of them did in the case of Hurricane Elsa as well, and helping to rebuild and helping to provide. But, Mr. President, when we look at the bill, we would see a couple of things I want to be able to identify, Mr. President. And I've talked about Section 5, which looks at the functions, and which identifies that now we don't have that focus in terms of agriculture, etc., because that now is with someone else. And we see that the focus now of the combined commission will really be on one, helping in terms of house repairs, also as well making sure that we can take care of other kind of sanitary deficits within particular households. But it also provides and keeps, because it was previously within the original Urban Development Act, this notion of areas for redevelopment. And I think that is something that we should spend us a little bit of time on, because that's important. Because even though it was not actioned, as far as I'm aware, under the original legislation, it's kept in here because it is part, again, of government's thrust at transformation. It envisions the possibility that government can look at a neighborhood and note that the conditions of an entire neighborhood could possibly be such that that neighborhood needs regeneration, and that the government can go in and be able to say, listen, we want to be able to fix some things for you. We want to make sure that you have the necessary septic wells that are in place. We want to make sure that we give you some space between the houses. You're not sitting on top of one another. We want to change the entryways. We want to have recreational facilities for you. And that's what, when you look at Section 25 of the bill, It provides, Mr. President, that the agency can make a proposal for a redevelopment plan, which again is subject and advertised, and it identifies within the bill how much times it has to be advertised, the fact that people can say no, and I am pointing out, the fact that people can actually then appeal as well. And the Act identifies that. But it provides for the opportunity, again, that government can make sure, again, that for some communities, and there are some communities, Mr. President, where you look at them, when you look at the situations of the houses and how they were built, there was no planning that happened within those neighborhoods, and people built houses, and there were houses, Mr. President, and neighborhoods and communities that were built within a particular context, that for a modern Barbados, that you would want to say, we have to do something different. And the bill provides for that contemplation, that we can do that. I also finally, Mr. President, because I thought it was very interesting as well, to note that as at section 14 of the bill, that it provides, and I want to be careful here, it says directions of the minister, section 14B, that the minister can give directions to the commission as appear to him to be necessary or expedient to ensure, and I'm paraphrasing, the preservation of any features of special architectural or historical interest. That is within the bill, Mr. President. That is within the bill, Mr. President. Ensuring, again, as we have done in other areas, that again, that there is preservation, Mr. President, of special architecture or historical interest. I don't listen to those kinds of asides. They make no sense and have absolutely no impact whatsoever. Because what do? We deliver, Mr. President. We deliver, Mr. President. So those that don't and thump their chests and then walk out, Mr. President, we will leave them to themselves, Mr. President, and we will continue on the government's work.
Kick people out of church.
Get people out of church. Senator Blackman, I thank you for reminding me. Of that, Senator Blackman. I thank you for reminding me. Thank you for reminding me, Mr. President. And finally, Mr. President, I want to, as I commend this legislation, and note as well that similar, again, to the bill that we would have debated previously, that this, the construction of this commission, the amalgamation, bringing together of the two entities, also involved extensive consultations with the unions. I said before, bringing in of a change management specialist right from the very beginning, making sure that we had legal direction as well, Mr. President, and all of that happening before. This process, I believe, Mr. President, happened over perhaps 4 or 5 years and has been ongoing to make sure that we are able to treat to this new entity, as much as it is represented here, in a way that is fair, one, yes, to the employees, but also as well that it takes into consideration how we appropriately bring together the resources of the two agencies in order to be able to optimize delivery, Mr. President. Mr. President, like I said, I'm not going to get tired of saying it, and we've discussed it before. And I actually think Senator Reverend Canon Dr. John Rogers, quote, that said to us, what did he say? That the true measure of a society is how it treats to its vulnerable. The true measure of a government is how it treats to its most vulnerable. A true measure of a government, it is intent and investment in the poor and in the vulnerable, Mr. President. Mr. President, I commend this bill, and I thank you. I'm obliged. Mr. President, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Warren. Oh, sorry. Any speakers? Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. I won't be long, but I think it is important that I say a few words on this particular bill. I had the privilege of being in the early stages of the discussions of this amalgamation. And at that time, we were seriously trying then to deal with a number of problems that would have faced both of the separate commissions over a long period of time. One of those things, which a lot of people at that time, and still even up to today, didn't speak a lot about, was the quality of work that was done in some areas where you were seeking to help the very most vulnerable among us. And even though we used the opportunity to give work to small contractors and persons like that, to do that, we still had some problems. And when I look through what the new entity is going to look like, one of the first things that stood out to me was senior quality management officers, of which there are going to be 6. And I felt as if, yes, we've finally taken the initiative to grab that particular problem by its neck and wrestle it to the ground. And I'm hoping that when we finally get this amalgamation done, some of the other confusion which used to happen, and I used to get telephone calls on a regular basis, where people were not sure, regardless of where they were living, who they should call. So you will have people in the rural area calling to urban, and urban saying to them, no, I don't deal with that stuff, you have to go to rural, and vice versa. And so now that people will understand that there's this one place where you can get all the information that you need, where you can get the assistance that you need, I think that is going to clear up a lot of the confusion that was there in the past. But the most important thing for me is this: as we grapple with climate change, and you have your naysayers, but I think those of us who live in the real world know that this is real. You can see the changes all around us. We're becoming more and more susceptible to hurricanes, storms, all of these kinds of things. And an agency such as this, which, as we can see with Hurricane Elsa and all the other things that they had to deal with, becomes more efficient now in being able to tackle those problems, God forbid, that we find ourselves in the clutches of such a game. And I think that this is a time where the naysayers should take the opportunity to, again, think about the well-being and the welfare of those persons we consider to be the most vulnerable in our society. And just to go back to my point again on the quality of work that we do, I'm going to say this here because I feel very strongly about it. And as I always say, who get vexed, get vexed. You cannot, I don't care who you are, workman, whoever, when you're building homes for human beings, you have to ensure that what you produce is of the best quality possible for persons. It doesn't matter if they live in Sandy Lane, in the highest, or if they live in the most vulnerable places. And with one of my pet peeves for a number of years is to have people calling constantly in my short tenure people calling every 5 minutes to complain about, oh, such and such, went and they did this, and they did that, and they did the third. By the time you get to it, this is done badly. It's got problems with leakage in the bathrooms, roof leaking, all these sorts of things. And I think, again, with this quality management people, if they do their jobs properly, you're also lifting a person who might be in dire straits. And I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to go through some parts of this country to see the abject poverty within which people live. And if we as a government are going to be the ones to help, we have to ensure that whilst we are helping the small entrepreneurs, that they themselves do things to a standard and a quality that that person, that vulnerable person, feels as if they really matter. Not that we're just doing it because we can, but when that person walks into their home, they must feel as if we actually care enough to make sure that the finishes in it are done properly. That when they turn that key and go in, they know with the families, if it's small family or large family, that they're not going to be having to call to say, oh, I have problems with bathrooms, or the taps leaking, or the electrical things are not good, or whatever. And once we can get that out of the way, I know from experience, when a human being feels good about themselves, you can see the change in how they deal with one another, and how they deal with the general public, how they view their lives. Everything changes. And so I just want to make the point that I'm extremely, extremely happy and may dare say proud that we've been able to at least ensure that there's some quality assurance in this. And I hope that a lot of the problems that we had in the past coming out of both entities will be a thing of the past, and that we can get things done more efficiently and better for the most vulnerable people living in this country. And with those few words, sir, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me also as well thank Senator King for his words, for his asking us to make sure that we look out for the quality issues and that we have places, homes where poor people, vulnerable people, when we're seeking to repair or build, can be proud of, can feel that they are stepping into something that someone has taken care of and paid attention to in terms of the build. And certainly, as Senator King would have pointed out, that within the restructuring, there is now a set of people who have been identified specifically to make sure that that happens, Mr. President. Mr. President, I think that there is general agreement that the bill is an important one, that the bill allows us to be able to right-size an institution by amalgamating the institution, by being able to pull together the resources from what would have been from the urban and from the rural in order for us to be able to provide scale. Mr. President, I beg that this bill be now read a second time.
The question is, that this bill be read a second time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that it do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Honourable Senate is now in committee. Permission granted to do so.
Part 1, clauses 1 to 3.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 to 3, now stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 to 3 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, would you say no, please? The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 4 to 20.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 4 to 20, do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 4 through 20 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 21 to 34.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 21 to 34, do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 21 through 34 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 38 to 37.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 35 to 37, do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 35 to 37 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no.
Part 4, clauses 38, Part 5, sorry, clauses 38 to 42.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 38 to 42, do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 38 through 42 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be now the schedule to the bill. With all honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The second schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be now the second schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Report, please.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Rural and Urban Development Commission Act 2025.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Rural and Urban Development Commission Act 2025. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
We'd like to recommit presentation of papers.
Presentation of papers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I am commanded to lay the following documents. The financial statements of the Transport Authority for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2023, the Barbados Health Report of 2022 and of 2023, the Barbados National Oil Company Limited Annual Report of 2023, the Enterprise Growth Fund Limited Annual Report 2024, the 2023 Barbados Economic and Social Report, the Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements of the National Cultural Foundation for the year ended March 31st, 2020, and the Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements of the Caves of Barbados Limited for the year ending March 31st, 2024. The Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the year ended March 31st, 2023 of the Barbados Aircraft and Aviation Services Company Limited. The Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements of Hotel and Resorts Limited for the year ended March 31st, 2024. Judges' Remuneration and Pensions Salaries Order of 2024. Judges' Remuneration and Pensions Conditions of Service and Allowance Amendment Regulations of 2024, Senate and House of Assembly Remuneration and Allowances of Members Order 2024, Ministers and Parliamentary Secretaries Conditions of Service Order of 2024, Public Service Part-Time Officers Order of 2024, the Supreme Court Master of the High Court Salary Order of 2024, the proposal for the acquisition of a data center, the National Insurance and Social Security Benefit Amendment Regulations 2025, the 2023 Barbados Economic and Social Report, the estimates of expenditure and revenue for 2025 and 2026, and the schedule of personal emoluments for the years 2025 and 2026. Mr. President, this brings us to the end of government's business for today's sitting, and I want to thank the honourable members for bearing with us for today. I know that this is an off day it is not a normal day for the Senate. I also want to take the opportunity, though, in the closing off of government's business for today to express appreciation to the staff of this chamber of the Parliament, because we know that over the course of the last several weeks, you have been engaged in the estimates, then you went into the budgetary process, and then today, on a Friday, you are here with us in the Senate for our sitting. And I want to definitely take the opportunity to express appreciation to you for your service to this country. That is especially important, Mr. President, because as I suspend today's sitting as opposed to adjourning today's sitting, we resume on Monday for the commencement of the estimates of expenditure in the Senate. And so the Senate will sit on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and we will be commencing the discussion of the Senate, of the estimates of expenditure. They will now be laid. We laid them earlier today in this chamber, and I look forward to having a full discussion about the planned estimates of expenditure for the year 2025 to 2026. I beg to move that this sitting is now suspended until Monday, March 17th at 10 a.m.
The question is that this sitting is suspended until Monday, March 17th at 10 a.m. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting is accordingly suspended until Monday, March 17 at 10 a.m.